Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. By sunrise, the laughter had vanished. Men who had spent their lives reading orchards stood in absolute silence at the fence line, staring across a valley that looked as though winter had erased every promise of spring. Acres of apple trees wore brittle black branches that snapped with a touch, while frozen blossoms drifted across the ground like forgotten confetti. Then every pair of eyes turned toward the smallest orchard on the ridge. Every trunk there still glowed white beneath a thin layer of frost, and every branch remained unbroken. Nobody spoke first because nobody wanted to admit the same thought. 3 months earlier, those were the very trees they had mocked. Nathaniel Brooks rested one gloved hand against the rough bark of the nearest tree before checking a tiny green bud hidden beneath the coating. He smiled only after he saw it was still alive, then quietly pulled his old thermos from the back of his pickup and poured a cup of coffee for the volunteer firefighter who had been helping neighbors all night. He never looked toward the crowd waiting for an explanation. He simply asked whether the firefighter had managed to get any sleep. The man shook his head. Nathaniel handed him the warm cup anyway. That simple gesture somehow made the silence even heavier. Someone finally whispered, "How did he know?" Another answered, "Nobody knows anything yet." Across the road, Derek Holloway stood beside the remains of his own orchard, unable to take his eyes off the white trunks catching the early light. Only yesterday he had been certain Nathaniel had ruined his farm with the strangest idea anyone had ever seen. Now reporters were already pulling onto the gravel shoulder, cameras pointed in only one direction. A county agriculture truck rolled slowly into the valley and stopped without turning off its engine. Grace Whitmore stepped out carrying a clipboard she no longer seemed interested in reading. Her attention stayed fixed on Nathaniel's orchard, then on the weather station mounted near his fence, then back to the trees. She frowned, not with disbelief, but with the expression of someone discovering that an answer had been hiding in plain sight all along. Nathaniel noticed her arrival, yet continued tightening a loose support strap around a young sapling instead of defending himself or celebrating. Micah stood several yards away, clutching a faded knit cap in both hands, watching the same neighbors who had laughed at his father now hesitate to cross the road. None of them seemed ready to speak first. Then Grace slowly knelt beside one of the white trunks, brushed away a thin layer of ice with her fingertips, and quietly said, "If this is what I think it is, everything we believed about surviving this winter is about to change." Nathaniel did not answer Grace immediately because the truth had not begun on the morning the valley froze. It had started months earlier, on an unusually warm October afternoon when most growers were celebrating perfect weather while he stood quietly beside an old wooden fence studying the afternoon sunlight instead of the trees. Micah climbed down from the battered pickup carrying a toolbox that looked older than he was and noticed his father staring toward the western ridge where clouds gathered in thin silver layers. "Is something wrong?" he asked. Nathaniel did not respond right away. He reached into his jacket and unfolded a weather journal with cracked leather corners, every page filled by careful handwriting dating back more than 30 years. Some entries belonged to his late father. Others belonged to him. Every unusually warm fall had been circled in blue pencil. Every devastating freeze had been marked with the same quiet sentence: "Do not trust October." Micah looked at the faded pages and frowned. "But the forecast says we will have another mild winter." Nathaniel nodded without looking away from the horizon. Forecasts describe the sky. Trees remember the ground. Micah was not sure what that meant, and neither was anyone else who passed their orchard that afternoon. Across the road, workers at Derek Holloway's enormous farm laughed as they unloaded expensive irrigation equipment designed to increase next season's yield. One of them pointed toward Nathaniel's notebook and joked that he was farming with ghost stories instead of science. Nathaniel ignored every word. Instead, he knelt beside a young apple tree, pressed his fingertips gently against its bark, and remained perfectly still for several seconds. "Feel this," he said. Micah touched the trunk, but shrugged. "It feels normal." Nathaniel smiled softly. "That is exactly what worries me. Before Micah could ask another question, a delivery truck stopped at the end of their gravel driveway. The driver unloaded several heavy buckets with bright warning labels that immediately caught the attention of passing neighbors. Within minutes, rumors spread through the valley that Nathaniel had ordered industrial paint instead of fertilizer. Some claimed he had finally lost hope after another difficult harvest. Others insisted the bank must have refused another loan. By sunset, strangers slowed their cars just to stare at the stacked buckets near the barn. Micah noticed people taking photographs from the road and quietly asked whether they should move the supplies inside. Nathaniel simply carried the first bucket into the equipment shed and locked the door. He never explained what was inside. That silence only made the whispers grow louder. The following morning, before the sun had cleared the hills, Micah opened the shed expecting to find ordinary white paint. Instead, he found his father carefully mixing a chalk-colored liquid according to measurements copied from the oldest page of his grandfather's weather journal, and taped beside that page was a single newspaper clipping with one sentence circled in red ink. The forgotten method saved only one orchard during the freeze of 1968. The newspaper clipping stayed on the workbench for less than a minute before Nathaniel folded it back into the weather journal and slid both beneath a stack of seed catalogs. But it was already too late. Because Micah had memorized the date and the headline. If it worked once before, why does nobody else know about it? He asked. Nathaniel sealed the bucket without answering. Instead, he loaded the containers into the back of the pickup and drove toward the neighboring Miller orchard. Their oldest spraying machine had broken down the evening before, and without it they would lose precious days preparing for the coming season. Nathaniel had planned to begin treating his own trees that morning, yet when he saw Mr. Miller struggling beside the disabled equipment, he quietly unpacked his own tools instead. Nearly 3 hours disappeared while he repaired a cracked hydraulic line using spare parts he had been saving for his own tractor. By the time the machine roared back to life, the sun had climbed high enough that Nathaniel no longer had enough daylight to begin his own project. Mr. Miller reached for his wallet, but Nathaniel simply smiled and said, "Just help somebody else when they need it." The older farmer stood speechless as the pickup pulled away. That single decision came with a price Nathaniel never mentioned. Every hour he lost reduced the narrow window he believed he had before temperatures changed. Micah watched his father glance repeatedly toward the sky instead of the clock, and for the first time wondered whether helping someone else might cost them their own harvest. As they returned home, several vehicles slowed beside the road. The white buckets stacked in the truck bed drew curious stares, and whispers spread even faster than before. One teenager laughed that Nathaniel must be planning to paint every tree like a backyard fence. Another neighbor joked that grief had finally clouded his judgment. Nathaniel never responded. He carried each bucket into the orchard one by one with the same calm expression he had worn while repairing the Miller equipment. Across the fence, Grace Whitmore happened to arrive for a routine inspection of irrigation permits. She recognized Nathaniel immediately because every local grower spoke highly of his honesty, yet the labels on the buckets forced her to pause. Agricultural coatings that unusual were almost never used in commercial orchards, and improper application could create serious problems. She walked toward the fence intending to ask a few simple questions, but stopped when she saw Nathaniel patiently helping Micah adjust a loose ladder before touching a single tree himself. Nothing about his careful routine matched the reckless rumors she had been hearing. Even so, she could not ignore what appeared to be an extraordinary risk. Before she could speak, her county phone rang. The caller identified himself as the State Agricultural Archive in Olympia. After confirming Nathaniel Brooks's address, the archivist asked one unexpected question. Does he still have Samuel Brooks's original winter journals? Because we have been searching for them for nearly 20 years. Grace ended the call without answering the archivist's final question because she suddenly realized the journals were no ordinary family records. Someone at the state level believed they mattered, yet Nathaniel had never mentioned them during any county meeting or agricultural workshop. Instead of confronting him immediately, she drove away with more questions than answers. By the next morning, however, the quiet rumors had become loud enough to reach the county office. Several growers filed formal complaints claiming Nathaniel intended to spread an unapproved coating across his orchard, while others insisted the bright white mixture would reflect sunlight onto neighboring properties and damage nearby crops. None of them had seen a single treated tree, Yet the accusations multiplied faster than facts. Nathaniel received a notice requesting a temporary review before completing the application across the entire orchard. Micah watched his father read every line without changing expression. "Does this mean we have to stop?" he asked. Nathaniel folded the paper carefully and replied, "It means we have to be certain every step is worth defending." That afternoon, he drove to the county office carrying one sealed bucket, laboratory documents for every ingredient, and the weather journal wrapped in a clean cloth. He never raised his voice during the meeting, even after hearing people describe his work as reckless. Speculation. Grace noticed something unusual. Whenever another grower criticized him personally, Nathaniel redirected the conversation back to soil temperatures, bark stress, and tree survival instead of defending his pride. His restraint unsettled her more than any argument could have. If he were simply chasing attention, why did he refuse every opportunity to create a scene? Still, regulations were regulations, and she could not ignore growing public concern. The review ended with permission for Nathaniel to continue only on his own property while inspectors collected additional information. Outside the building, reporters were already waiting. Cameras followed him across the parking lot, hoping for an angry statement. Nathaniel declined every microphone and quietly helped an elderly woman reload 2 heavy boxes that had fallen from her trunk before driving away without another word. Several witnesses recorded the moment, but the evening news ignored it completely. Instead, television broadcasts focused on aerial footage of white buckets stacked beside his barn, calling the project one of the valley's strangest agricultural experiments. By sunset, more drivers gathered along the roadside than ever before, some laughing, others shaking their heads, while children pointed toward the orchard as though it had become a local attraction. Micah tried not to look at them, but he heard every joke through the open truck window. When they finally reached home, Nathaniel unlocked the old barn and removed the weather journal once again. As he turned another brittle page, a folded envelope slipped onto the floor. It had never been opened. Across the front, written in fading blue ink by Samuel Brooks decades earlier, were only 7 words that instantly drained the color from Nathaniel's face. "Open only if the first frost comes early." For several long seconds, Nathaniel simply stared at the unopened envelope before carefully breaking the brittle seal, almost as though he feared the words inside had been waiting decades for exactly this moment. Micah stood beside him without speaking. The letter was surprisingly short. Samuel Brooks had written that every generation eventually mistakes unusual autumn warmth for safety, but the trees never forget the patterns hidden beneath the soil. He warned that when several quiet signs appeared together, warm afternoons, unusually cold ground before sunrise, and dry winds arriving from the western ridge, a destructive freeze could arrive weeks before any forecast predicted. At the bottom of the page was not a recipe, but a hand-drawn map marking only one small section of the orchard where Samuel had tested a mineral-based reflective coating after the devastating freeze of 1968. Nathaniel quietly closed his eyes. The coating had never been the real secret. Observation had always come first. The mixture only worked because it was applied at exactly the right moment. Micah looked toward the window where the afternoon sunshine still felt almost like early September. "Nobody will believe this," he whispered. Nathaniel folded the letter with the same care his father had used decades earlier. "They do not have to believe it today." Early the next morning, before anyone else entered the orchard, Nathaniel began coating the first rows exactly as Samuel had described, measuring every interval instead of rushing to finish. From the road, passing drivers slowed to record videos of the strange white trunks spreading across the hillside. Each recording reached more people than the last, and before noon local radio hosts were openly debating whether Nathaniel had become dangerously desperate after several difficult harvests. Yet something unexpected happened inside the county office. Grace could not stop thinking about the state archivist's call, so she searched old agricultural records stored in the basement archives. Most files contained ordinary reports, but one weather survey from 1968 included several photographs that immediately caught her attention. Every surviving orchard in those faded black and white images displayed pale trunks remarkably similar to the ones now appearing across Nathaniel's farm. There was no explanation attached, only a handwritten note that read, "Temporary bark treatment observed." Long-term evaluation never completed. Grace frowned. If such evidence already existed, why had nobody continued the research? Before she could investigate further, another document answered part of the question. Funding for the study had ended after the lead researcher died unexpectedly the following spring. The project disappeared before anyone repeated the experiment. She leaned back slowly, realizing Nathaniel might not be inventing anything at all. He could be preserving knowledge everyone else had forgotten. Even so, one enormous question remained unanswered. If the method had truly shown promise decades earlier, why had Samuel Brooks hidden his journals instead of publishing them? Grace reached for her phone, intending to call Nathaniel immediately, but before she could dial, an emergency weather bulletin interrupted every local station with an unexpected update. Meteorologists had just detected an unusually powerful Arctic air mass changing direction, and for the first time all season, the projected path pointed directly toward their valley. The forecast changed again before sunrise, and this time nobody laughed. Temperatures that had been expected to remain safely above freezing were suddenly predicted to plunge below 20 degrees Fahrenheit within 48 hours. Hardware stores sold out of frost blankets before noon. Fuel deliveries were delayed by panicked orders, and every grower in the valley began searching for ways to protect trees that had already started waking from an unusually warm autumn. Nathaniel never rushed. He finished coating the last section of his orchard with the same measured pace he had followed from the beginning, checking every trunk twice before quietly storing the remaining mixture inside the barn. Micah noticed something that no one else had seen. His father was not treating every tree exactly the same. A handful of the youngest saplings received an additional protective wrap beneath the white coating. Why only those? He asked. Nathaniel looked toward the darkening western ridge before answering. Because they have never survived a hard winter before. The response seemed simple, yet it revealed that every decision had been planned long before the warning reached the evening news. Meanwhile, Grace returned to the orchard carrying copies of the archived photographs from 1968. She placed one beside a freshly coated trunk, then another beside an untouched tree on a neighboring property. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. Even Derek, who had stopped by only to watch the growing spectacle, found himself staring silently at the matching patterns in the bark. For the first time, nobody joked about white trees. Instead, uncomfortable questions replaced easy laughter. If Samuel Brooks had discovered something valuable decades ago, why had the farming community allowed it to disappear? Why had nobody listened when Nathaniel quietly followed the same path? Grace finally asked the question that had been bothering her since opening the archive box. Why did your father leave the journals only to you? Nathaniel hesitated before answering. Because he knew people would copy the mixture without learning the reason behind it. Grace lowered the papers. Suddenly, every strange choice Nathaniel had made gained a different meaning. The notebook, the careful timing, the weather observations, even the hours spent helping neighbors instead of defending himself, all pointed to discipline rather than luck. Yet one problem remained. Knowledge alone could not stop an Arctic front. By late afternoon, the first bitter wind swept across the valley, stronger than any forecast had predicted. Emergency alerts urged growers to activate every available frost protection system before nightfall. Trucks filled the roads, generators roared to life, and neighbors who had ignored Nathaniel for weeks suddenly drove past his gate more slowly than before, uncertain whether to ask for help or cling to familiar methods. Micah watched headlights gathering along the roadside and quietly asked the question everyone seemed afraid to voice. If they come now, will you tell them everything? Nathaniel looked across hundreds of vulnerable trees stretching toward the horizon, then toward the weather journal resting on the passenger seat. Before he could answer, 3 pickups turned into his driveway at the same moment, and the first person to step out was Derek Holloway, removing his hat before saying a single word. Derek stood quietly for several seconds before speaking, a silence that felt heavier than any argument he had made during the past months. Behind him were 3 neighboring growers whose faces showed the same mixture of worry and pride. None of them wanted to admit why they had come. Finally, Derek looked directly at Nathaniel and said, "I cannot change what I said before. I can only ask whether there is still time to save what is left." The question lingered in the freezing wind. Micah watched his father without blinking, wondering whether this would be the moment he finally refused the people who had laughed at them. Instead, Nathaniel opened the barn, rolled out several spare sprayers, and calmly divided the remaining buckets between the waiting trucks. "Cover the youngest trees first," he said. "Do not rush. A missed section is worse than a slow one." Nobody argued. The same neighbors who had once filmed him for entertainment now copied every movement with complete attention. Grace stood nearby taking notes, realizing that Nathaniel never once mentioned who had mocked him or who owed him an apology. He spoke only about protecting orchards before the temperature collapsed. That choice changed the atmosphere more than any speech could have. Even so, there was not enough coating for every farm in the valley. Nathaniel quietly unfolded Samuel's weather map and marked only the orchards facing the strongest western exposure. "These families are at the greatest risk tonight," he explained. Some growers immediately questioned why others should receive help first, but Grace examined the terrain and recognized the same wind corridor identified in the old archive photographs. Nathaniel was not choosing favorites. He was following evidence. Still, every bucket delivered to another farm meant fewer reserves for unexpected problems in his own orchard. Micah noticed the last unopened container sitting alone in the barn and whispered, "Should we keep that one?" Nathaniel looked across the rows of young trees before shaking his head. Someone will need it more before morning. As darkness settled over the valley, freezing winds swept through the hills with surprising force. Emergency radios reported falling temperatures faster than expected, and power flickered across several rural roads. Farmers raced through their orchards under portable lights while Nathaniel drove from property to property, helping calibrate sprayers instead of staying home to protect his own land. More than once he repaired broken equipment with parts taken from his own truck, sacrificing precious minutes while the cold intensified. Grace followed behind, documenting everything she witnessed because she knew nobody would believe the story otherwise. Shortly before midnight, she returned to Nathaniel's orchard expecting to find him there at last. Instead, she found only Micah standing beside the weather station, staring toward the distant highway with growing concern. Nathaniel's pickup was gone, the final bucket was gone, and fresh tire tracks disappeared into the darkness toward the oldest orchard in the entire valley, where an elderly widow lived alone with hundreds of unprotected trees, and no one had seen her answer a single phone call all evening. Just before dawn, Nathaniel reached the widow Eleanor Harper's orchard and found her standing alone beside an old generator that refused to start. She had already wrapped blankets around several young trees with her own hands, but the freezing wind was stronger than anything she could fight by herself. Without wasting a second, Nathaniel handed her the final bucket, repaired the fuel line on the generator using the last spare fitting from his truck, and showed her exactly where to apply the protective coating before the cold reached its worst. By the time the first pale light appeared above the hills, both of them were exhausted, their gloves stiff with frost, but the youngest trees had been protected. Nathaniel never mentioned that his own orchard had been left unattended for hours. He simply thanked Eleanor for trusting him and quietly drove home. As sunrise spread across the valley, the true cost of the night became impossible to ignore. Orchard after orchard revealed darkened buds and damaged branches where the sudden freeze had struck with full force. Farmers walked silently between rows they had expected to bloom in spring, unsure how much could still be saved. Then people began arriving at Nathaniel's hillside one truck at a time. They expected to find the same destruction. Instead, they found healthy buds beneath white trunks that still reflected the morning light. Grace carefully cut open several sample buds from different sections of the orchard in front of everyone. Each one showed fresh green tissue instead of the dull brown damage appearing elsewhere. She repeated the inspection at Eleanor's orchard and discovered the same result. No speech was necessary because the evidence spoke more clearly than any argument. Derek lowered his head before walking across the road toward Nathaniel. In full view of neighbors, reporters, and county officials, he removed his work gloves and extended his hand. "I spent months believing pride was experience," he admitted quietly. "You proved that humility sees farther." Nathaniel accepted the handshake without hesitation, then immediately turned to the gathering crowd. Instead of celebrating, he spread Samuel's journals across the tailgate of his pickup and invited every grower to study the weather records, the observations, and the lessons written over decades. He explained that the coating alone was never the answer. Careful observation, patience, and timing had always mattered more than any mixture in a bucket. Grace watched families photograph every page, not to copy a shortcut, but to understand the reasoning behind it. Micah stood nearby as neighbors who had once laughed now thanked his father one after another. None of them praised him because he had won an argument. They thanked him because he had chosen to help even after being dismissed. As the crowd slowly drifted away, Grace carefully closed the final journal and handed it back to Nathaniel. "Your father preserved more than notes," she said softly. "He preserved a way of seeing." Nathaniel smiled, but before he answered, Micah unfolded one last brittle sheet that had slipped unnoticed from the back cover, revealing a hand-drawn sketch and a short handwritten message that neither of them had ever seen before. Micah carefully unfolded the brittle sheet while everyone around the pickup instinctively leaned closer, expecting another forgotten formula or secret mixture, but instead they found a simple pencil sketch of the orchard drawn by Samuel Brooks decades earlier. Beneath the drawing was a single handwritten sentence that seemed almost too ordinary after everything they had discovered. It read, "The greatest harvest is the neighbor who learns before the storm arrives." Nathaniel stood quietly for a long moment before folding the page again. Suddenly, every choice his father had made carried a deeper meaning. The journals had never been hidden to protect a valuable recipe. They had been protected because knowledge without patience could become carelessness, and Samuel wanted the next generation to understand the responsibility before the method. Weeks later, the valley began preparing for spring. While damaged orchards slowly recovered, something unexpected changed even faster than the trees. Every Saturday morning, growers gathered at Nathaniel's small barn instead of competing across fence lines. Weather journals appeared beside coffee mugs. Young farmers compared soil temperatures before discussing fertilizer. Grace organized a county workshop built around observation rather than shortcuts, crediting Samuel Brooks's preserved records and Nathaniel's willingness to share them freely. Derek volunteered the largest meeting space on his property and quietly admitted that he had learned more from one difficult winter than from years of believing he already knew every answer. Eleanor Harper arrived carrying a homemade apple pie baked from the final apples saved before the freeze. She placed it on the table without ceremony and smiled at Micah. "Your father reminded all of us what neighbors are supposed to do," she said. Micah glanced toward Nathaniel, who was helping a young couple repair a broken pruning tool instead of standing at the front of the room accepting praise. That image stayed with him more than every newspaper story and television interview that followed. By early spring, tiny blossoms covered the once white trunks that had drawn so much laughter only months before. Visitors traveled from neighboring counties to see the orchard, but many left talking less about the coating and more about the quiet farmer who had chosen generosity over pride when he had every reason to do the opposite. One warm afternoon, Micah walked beside his father through rows filled with fresh blossoms and finally asked the question he had been carrying since the first cold morning. "Dad, when everyone laughed at us, were you ever afraid they might be right?" Nathaniel looked across the orchard where children from several farming families were now helping one another plant new saplings. He smiled gently before answering, "Of course I was. But trees do not grow because people believe in them. They grow because someone cares for them every single day." Micah looked back at the white trunks that had become symbols of hope instead of ridicule, understanding at last why his father had never wasted time arguing. Some truths bloom only after people are ready to see them. Thank you for watching until the end of the video.